Hey, everybody. Scott Bischoff from Detroit Lions podcast. We are going to give you some generalized thoughts about the combine to this point, and it's been interesting. So hang right there. We'll be back right after the break. Combine. It is Sunday morning. We still have offensive linemen and running backs to go, which should be a pretty exciting day. Just some generalized thoughts for whatever they're worth. Okay, so I think you have the quarterbacks separate themselves. So I think that's you look at the way Stroud threw yesterday and how accurate he is, and that's backed up on his film. You look at the freak show that showed up with Anthony Richardson. I can't believe I'm not calling him Antonio. I'm just surprised at myself. I'll get there. Richardson was just ridiculous. I think Will Levis did some things to both calm concerns, but also raise concerns. But in the end, he's a good enough prospect that, I think he's clearly number 4 of the 4, but I think that I think there's reasons that one team in particular may like him more than some of the other guys, and that might be Houston. And then there's Bryce Young, who played the game of I'm going to weigh real heavy and lose all that weight, that water weight, and then I'm going to run a little and throw at my pro day. So I hope everybody sees through that kind of through the game that he played, and I don't blame him at all, because let's be honest, with Richardson looking the way he looked and ripping throws and Stroud doing similar things, I think he would have been underwhelming. I do. Although he's an incredible prospect, it's just you're talking about just over 5'10" player who measured in at, I want to say 204 pounds, but probably plays in the high 180s, low 190s max. But still, quarterbacks perform pretty well. Running backs are yet to go. I think we have a kind of a weaker wide receiver class. I know Quentin Johnston is good. He's solid. Jaxon, Smith-Njigba is legit. And then after that, there's a chasm there's a significant fall to like what I would consider the next group. One player who did have a great workout is Bryce Ford-Wheaton from West Virginia. I would call this a very weak wide receiver class, which is bizarre. The inverse of that is the tight end groups. The tight end group was ridiculous. There are good tight ends everywhere in this draft. If you're looking at what the Lions did moving TJ Hockenson and not having to pay him, my guess is you're going to find a pretty solid player in round 2 and round 3 kind of thing. And if that's the route you take for a tight end, we'll see. It was a very good, it's a good group of tight ends, very deep. The defensive tackle class is interesting. You've got a large group of players I think are reasonable players, but Bryan Bresee, Calijah Kancey, and Jalen Carter are those are the dudes. They're all different. So it's just kind of like what flavor ice cream what kind of ice cream do you want? We have a solid edge class. I don't think it's elite, including at the top. I'm not sure that it's interesting. As much as I've watched Will Anderson, I'm not totally wowed by him this year. It bothers me that he played inside so much at 4I and sometimes as a 3, which is essentially lined up. It's essentially lined up between the guard and the tackle. It bothers me. Now, this is subtle and nitpicking, but it bothers me that I don't see him win more outside an offensive tackle. I want him to win more there, and I'm struggling to find that, and I'm just being completely honest. This is a situation where I can be totally wrong on that one, but I just don't see it like others see it with Will Anderson. But after that, I think you have a solid class. I don't think it's I don't think it's elite. I think Tyree Wilson would have done great things from a measurable standpoint, but he didn't test. I think you have a good group of linebacker prospects. But we have to remember, the linebacker position is not hugely impactful. All that, I mean, it's like, you fill those roles and those spots and that kind of stuff, but I think teams that draft linebackers really early have really struggled to come up with good players in the last several drafts. Clearly there are players who tested really well, but it's a question of whether or not these players are super impactful in the modern day defense. And I think you can find players later that can do similar things and just a philosophical thing, I guess. The cornerback group is super interesting. Obviously, you have some of the studs at the top. You have Christian Gonzalez, who tested crazy good. We're going to talk about him in a second. Joey Porter Jr. looked good. I have less concerns about Porter's speed than I think he's fine. Devin Witherspoon also played that game. Like he talked about, he had a hamstring injury, but his pro day's in a week, less than a week at this point. So I think it's a little bit of, I needed to weigh heavier than what I really am, and I'll test a week from now. So I'll alleviate some concerns, even though he is still small. And then you've got that top group, and then you've got, a bunch of players who I think are like Emmanuel Forbes tested or measured in at 166 pounds. I don't know what you do with that. It's just too small. And if you watch part 2, I did talk about him getting bounced around a lot. I mean, he's, it looks pretty when he intercepts passes and scores, but he's just too small. And he's not going to tackle. It's just, you're not going to see a bunch of that. So it's a deep class. It's a very deep class. But it's kind of like, if you don't take one of the elite guys, you might want to wait a little bit. Deonte Banks, I think, would be really an interesting player for them. I just think 18's too soon. Again, this is early, but it's just, so as much as the class has been talked about, there are some clear players at the top who make some sense. Christian Gonzalez, let's talk about him for a second. I know he tested great. I fully expected him to. If you watched part 1 of the cornerback video, it was obvious that he could run. He was an elite runner, mover. He pattern matches at a rare level. He does very impressive things. The problem is that he's not physical enough, and I worry that he's not competitive the way you want a corner to be competitive. There are times when you can see him in perfect coverage down the field, 20, 30 plus yards down the field, and he still gives up completions because he's not competitive at the catch point. I don't know that he's going to fit exactly with what Aaron Glenn and Campbell are looking for out of that position. So if you look at like a Devin Witherspoon junkyard dog mentality dude, Gonzalez is a little bit the opposite of that, where you really need to get him more competitive. I worry that's a problem for Gonzalez. But we have to acknowledge that he had a great combine, and he looks, obviously he moves incredibly well. So that's thoughts on the combine, just very generalized. We're going to wrap this up this week for Detroit Lions podcast, I believe. But again, running backs are going, offensive line are going, so I didn't include any of those in. That's going to be an interesting day. Those are the generalized combine thoughts to this point. You guys have a great one.